the German Federal Parliament, and 50 Shades of Federalism, which is a website project that we host here at Canterbury Christ Church University, which publishes short papers on federalism. The idea of the online series Turn on Federalism, where this is now our 9th event, is that we discuss the papers that have been published on 50 Shades of Federalism with the authors, with a wider audience, and we build an international community of scholars for exchange of ideas, but also an international community of practitioners to discuss the relevance of the federal idea in the 21st century. Today's session does not only deal with the largest federal country in the world, but we are indeed looking at the largest country overall. We will be looking at Russia, and we will be looking at contemporary federalism in Russia. What are the key characteristics of Russian federalism? And how has it changed? As our speaker will highlight in her presentation, Russian federalism has been everything but static in the last 30 years. When we look at Russia, we do not just find a vast, a massive country, but we find one characterized by ethnic, political, economic, social, and cultural diversity. And that raises the question to what extent federalism can help manage and hold this diverse country together. We are very, very pleased to welcome our speaker today. Our speaker is Professor Elena Kremyanskaya. She is the acting head of the chair of public law and an associate professor at the Department of International Law at MGIMO University in Moscow. Those of you who join us regularly will know our presenter for the series. Our presenter and our moderator is a wonderful Anja Richter. She is a resident representative of the Hans Seidel Foundation in London in the United Kingdom. Before I hand over to Elena, please allow me to point out two further things. The first thing is, for any questions for Elena, please use the Q&A box. Write any questions you have in there, any comments you have in there, and we will pick them up and pass them on to the speaker. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you will enjoy today's presentation. And without further delay, I am handing over to Professor Elena Kremyanskaya. Elena, you have the word.
Okay, Søren, thank you very much. I'm really sorry for some technical outages, but well, hopefully everything will be smooth further. So I'm switching to my presentation. And I do hope that it works. Okay, so thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be part of this event. Before I start, I would like to share my appreciation of the work that is done by Søren and by his colleagues in creation of this series of 50 Shades of Federalism, which helps a lot us as academics to get more knowledge about federalism. And also we share this information with our students as well, so they can have a deep understanding of current practices that they for sure can't find in the books, because of course sometimes publication of books so need time. So my goal today is to speak about my own country, to speak about Russia, and to share Russian experience. And I would be happy to discuss, to get your questions as well, because this issue is so complex and so interesting and still is developing, that of course there are a lot of points, a lot of questions that we can discuss. And so some questions that I would like to discuss and to address in my presentation if the federalism should be really part of federation, or there can be a federation without federalism and it can exist. So if highly centralized federation with a lot of tracks of unitarization of unitary state is still a federation. And if this centralization can stabilize the federation and to help to ensure security. Why it's interesting from my perspective, because for sure each state is created to bring us stability, to bring people prosperity, and how this mechanism of coordination between powers, between bodies, can be realized in such way that the country can develop in a smooth way without any major issues. And I would like to present this information using my article, which was published in this series of 50 Shades of Federalism in 2019, with the name of Unitarization of Federation, Path to Stability, Path to Stability. By the way, while preparing to this presentation, I was thinking about how this world is developing fast, because the article was finished in 2019, and the next year nobody knew so that humanity will face this COVID-19 issue, and that the tendencies that we see in Russia, and I think not only in Russia but in other foreign federations as well, that the countries started moving towards unitarization in order to ensure provision of good and real support to the citizens in this counteraction with pandemic through the whole world. So, but let me speak first about Russia, about Russian history, and then we'll move back to our modern issues as well. Several words about Russia. Russia is one of the Russian federations, so we use two official names. So this is one of the hugest territory, hugest countries. So you see that it's the territory, we have about 11 time zones, and when people are falling asleep in Vladivostok, so people in Moscow are waking up. And so population is about 144 million people. It is a very multinational country, and so scientists have calculated that it is about 190 ethnic groups and about 150 languages spoken. However, of course, Russian language is used by all people who are living in Russia. And so the territory of Russia, of the Russian Federation as a federation, consists of subnational entities. We call them officially subjects of federation in accordance with the Russian constitution. And now we do have 85 subjects of federation. So I can say that this number slightly changed from the time the constitution was adopted. And so we can also cover this process a little bit later if you're interested in. So for you just to see the map, so you see this as, Russia is covering both European part and some Asian part. And you see that subjects of Federation of Russian subnational units in Asian parts, so territory are seriously huger. However, they are less populated. For example, so you see, so marked by green, it's Sakha-Yakutia. It's hugest territorially hugest subjects of federation. However, the population is very, very small. However, in the European part, you can see a lot of territorially smaller so subjects of federation or subnational units. However, of course, the density of population is high. So several words about the Russian Constitution. Russian Constitution was adopted in 1993 after fall of the Soviet Union. So 15 republics, former Soviet Union republics, they became independent, and for sure they were in need in their own constitutions. So the Russian Constitution, Russia adopted its own constitution. And I can see that if we compare constitutions of Russia and its neighbor countries, former republics, so they are more or less looking the same. However, there are some, of course, differences from the perspective of territorial construction. In accordance with the Russian constitution, Russia is a federal state. So territory of Russia includes territories of its subjects of federation. And we have 6 different types of subjects of federation. So later on, I will speak about them as well. So let me briefly cover Russian federal history, because it looks like quite interesting, and in a very short, from historical perspective period, we have seen really different tendencies. Just several words about the Soviet period. So first, Russia as a part of the Soviet Union was declared as a federation. It was not really part of Soviet Union. It was after the revolution in 1917. So it was declared 1918 as a federation. And later on, it became part of the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was a federation, but Russia, as a part of the Soviet Union, was a federation as well, in accordance with the constitution. It is interesting that the URI, it was federation. However, from practical perspective, it was very centralized and very unitarized federation, because probably you have heard about the role of the Communist Party in the Soviet times. And of course, most of the decisions were adopted through the party mechanisms. That's why, so the republics, parts of Soviet Union, they have no, so their rights were really, really limited. Of course, they had some rights, but they were really limited. So after the fall of Soviet Union, and Russia became a federation, and Russia became independent federation, and new constitution was adopted. So the problem is that the URI, this federation, was announced as a federation with quite huge rights of subjects of federation. However, in practice, a lot of subnational units, they started to demand sovereignty and independence. And mostly, this process was covering national republics. So it's necessary to mention that among the 6 types of subnational units in Russia, there are republics, and these republics, so they are organized on the basis of national principle. And they started to demand to recognize them as sovereign states, and they fixed it in their local legislation. Of course, it was not in line with Russian constitution, but nevertheless, they were using this practice. They also started to demand demand their rights to establish direct diplomatic relations with other countries. So just trying to show everyone that they are really sovereign parts of Russia. And So even they wanted to fix the principle that their local legislation will be over the federal one, and so and federal legislation should be ratified in advance by local state bodies. Of course, it was not in line with the Russian constitution at all, and uh, it really brought instability to a country. However, the federal government was trying to establish bargains with these subjects in order to have political support. So, in the 20th century, the period which is in Russia is known as so-called sovereignty parades when the federal government has signed more than 40 agreements on the competence distribution with subnational units, and these agreements, they really violated Russian constitution, which in accordance with its text has its supreme force. What was the main reason? The main reason was political because Russian president wanted to have support from local governments in order to be re-elected again to a presidential position, and he treated these relations as bargain relations. So each of republic had its own status, had its own set of rights, which was not in line with so federal constitution. Also, I would like to mention the issues in budgetary relations when so regions which claim sovereignty, so they demonstrated their will to have its sovereignty, so they got sometimes much more money comparing with other regions. And of course, it was not in line with the constitution and it was not fair. The result at the end of 1919, the country faced the real risk of dissolution when federal government was not able to coordinate interests with some regions, and the main issues were with Caucasian republics. And we can say also there were issues with Far East territories as well, because territories are quite far from Moscow. So at the beginning of 21st century, Russia got new president, and his approach to federalism was totally different. So he tried to stop this illegal practice. Of course, he was not alone, because I would like to mention Russian Constitutional Court, which participated in this process. Participated from perspective of announcing these individual agreements which were signed before as contradicting the Russian constitution. Frankly speaking, Constitutional Court did it before as well, but the compliance was not on the best level. So, but after the beginning of the 21st century, this process became more efficient. And so all these individual agreements with regions, which were contradicting Russian constitutions, they were nullified. Also, the reform of the Federation Council was announced. Federation Council is the upper chamber of the Russian parliament, which represents interests of subnational units. And before, so members of this chamber, they were they were governors, so the head of executive and legislative branches of power in the subjects of federation. After this reform, they were just representatives which were nominated by subnational units. Also, the system of federal districts was introduced when several subnational units were united in order to ensure better interaction with federal government, and each federal district have got the envoy, so representative of the Russian president, whose main goal was just to establish relations and to ensure that federal government control these territories. And one more issue was proposed and it was realized. However, it exists for about 10 years. So when the governors of regions were not elected by people, but they were elected by parliaments, local parliaments, under presidential proposal. This system gave more confidence, much more confidence to a federal government. And the practice showed us that while being a seriously decentralized federation at the end of 20th century, with a high risk of dissolution, at the beginning of 21st century, Russia became a federation which is centralized, which is controlled, and I can say that, so this is my opinion and opinion of my colleagues, that the risk of dissolution does not exist. So now we have centralized federation. It is an asymmetrical federation since republics, they have some wider status because these subjects, so they are nationally created. So there are also some asymmetries in the sphere of budget funding, when some regions can get better, if I can say, better financial injections comparing with other regions, and we can later discuss the reasons for that. And we can see now that centralization is even increasing, because there is a stable mechanism of control from a federal government over the governors of each subnational unit. So they are getting some really serious directions from the federal government. And of course, we should not forget about the pandemic and COVID-19, so which showed that such serious issues to the state can't be solved by subnational units by themselves. For sure, they need really serious support from the federal government, and this support is both legal support and support from the budget perspective as well. So just for you to see this structure, now we have 95 subnational entities and 6 types. So republics, so they're national type subjects of federation. We have territories, regions, federal cities. So we do have 3 federal cities, or cities of federal importance, as it's mentioned in the Russian Constitution. We also have autonomous region and autonomous territories. One more thing which we got last year from amendments to the Russian Constitution, the new type of territory was introduced. It is called federal territory. So this is a part of Russian territory which is directly controlled by federal government. And this territory should be territory really important, really important. By the way, there are still a lot of questions, because this was created due to amendments to the Russian Constitution, and we are waiting for federal legislation to have more clarity about this type. So in Russia, in accordance with Constitution, so there is a vertical separation of power as well. So so there are three types of competence: exclusive competence of federation, joint competence, so issues that can be solved together between so federation and subnational units, and exclusive competence of subnational units as well. On that slide, I'm giving some examples, but the list is quite huge, and this list is included into the Russian constitution. Judging the whole setup, we can see that the federation, of course, has the really vast powers, and federation is settling the most important issues. However, in the sphere of joint competence, there are the issues which require really dialogue between the federation and subnational units. For example, in the sphere of protection of the rights and freedoms, social protection, so carrying out measures against catastrophes and epidemics, and we have seen how it works nowadays in these so pandemic times. And as for exclusive competence of subnational units, it is described in the Constitution on a residual basis. So as examples, we can use, for example, issues of system of subnational bodies, subnational budget. However, what is important that the frames are set by federal laws, and so subnational units can play only in the sphere which is framed by the federation. Okay. So just several words about how the country reacted to COVID-19. Last year we see really very interesting processes. When at the first stage, so Russian president, when he announced this status of high alert mode, as we call it in Russia, so he said that a lot of powers are going to governors in order to settle these powers on the level of subnational units. And moreover, after this division of powers, my colleagues, so they started to discuss the point that, well, Russia is turning to the perspective of decentralized federation, and the federation is ready to share a lot of powers. But at the same time, when the governors, they got really serious rights, for example, to suspend activity of companies, to close schools, restaurants, and so on. So they even have got some powers in the sphere of establishing limitations of the right of free movement, because people were prohibited to move for a certain period of time. But at the same time, the control from federal government was reinforced. So because the serious personal and collective liability of subnational governments was stressed, and of course the subnational units so depend on money which federal government sends to them in order to counteract this COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why nowadays, we can state that further centralization is in place, and this pandemic is also playing its role. Okay, just finalizing what I wanted to say today. So there are some lessons learned. And first of all, first lesson that the country can move quite fastly from the process of really wild decentralization with a risk of dissolution to fairly centralization. From a historical perspective, this more than 20 years, it's a very, very small period of time. So what also is interesting, that economically power regions usually have wider political status because they have much more money, And so this asymmetry in the relations is both constitutional and political as well. Sometimes economic power grows on national aspirations. So when republics, for example, they use their national powers in order to establish dialogue with the federal government and even to bargain, to push federal government to give them money and to support them. So, of course, Russian asymmetry is quite logical from my perspective because it is based on the development of the country and history of development and multinationalism. And pandemic of COVID-19 is also already played a role in the development of Russian federalism. However, currently it turned Russia to the rails of a really centralized federation as well. Thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I would be happy to answer them.
Well, thank you very much, Elena, for your presentation, and hello to our global audience. Great to have you with us and from so many countries again. For those of you who are new to this seminar series or just joined us a bit later, this is now the part where you get to ask questions and participate in the debate. So you can ask Elena questions on her presentation or on federalism in Russia more generally, but also raise issues that may relate more to your respective countries. As Sören mentioned, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I've already seen a few in there. Please keep those questions short and refrain from comments so we can get through as many questions as possible. I will start us off with a question to Elena on the various territories and the structure of Russia you've outlined, and I can see we already got a few questions on that as well. I think we're all a bit flabbergasted by the number of different subnational units. You have argued that as the biggest country in the world with this huge territory and ethnic groups, nationalities, languages, Russia can only be governed as a federation. However, decentralization brought Russia close to collapse, leading to a rollback of the process and to a more centralization or unitarization of the federation to stabilize the country. That gave the president nearly total control, concluding that this might also be dangerous for the governance of such a vast state and only defers the risk that Russia faces in holding the country together. What, in your view, could or should be the way forward? Could or should Russia be governed as a federation, not only in name and as a form of territorial structure, but also by applying federalist principles in practice?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. You hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. So
Oh dear, I think, Elena, we are losing you. Let's see. Seems to be that global internet outage is affecting many of us. Elena, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here. I'm sorry. Can you hear?
I hope our audience can as well.
Yeah.
If you would like to start again your answer on whether Russia should be governed as a federation, not only in name, but also apply federalist principles in practice.
Okay, Anya, thank you very much for this really good question, because this question is being discussed for a long time by Russian lawyers and so politicians. So from one perspective, it can be cheaper to have a unitary state in order not to pay all these governments and so on. But on the other hand, I do believe that Russia should be a federation, because so historically, it was development for the last 100 years already. It was developing as a federation, however centralized, but still federation. So there are a lot of national groups whose interests should be considered in order to help them to live in such ways they want to live. And by the way, I have recollected in my memories, there was one case about 10 years ago in one of our presidential elections. One of the candidates have expressed his opinion that Russia should be a unitary state. And it seems so that he was not supported. So because he got a lot of critics from Russian regions and mostly from republics. Because it is very, very difficult to ensure so their rights are so protected in case we do have a unitary state. At the same time, if we think about the type of federation, it's hardly possible to imagine now that Russia is a decentralized one. And I think that there are some aspects, historical, first of all, aspects, and probably cultural aspects. You know, Russia is situated both in Europe and Asia. And I think that this combination of mentalities led Russians to have quite a strong power from a central government. So they do believe that central government should have the last word. And it's hardly possible to imagine such type of federation as, for example, Switzerland has, where so they are quite decentralized from our perspective, at least. And so they can settle a lot of issues. I mean, cantons can settle a lot of issues by themselves. So my answer is, well, I do believe that Russia should be a federation, but probably closer to a centralized one.
There's a question which I think goes back to more the historical development, or how Russia sort of came together as a federation. The question is, how did Russia get subnational units united? So probably wondering where the origins to those subnational units lie.
So the history goes back to Russian Empire, because so the strategy of Russian Empire for a long time was to collect regions, to collect territories. And so Russian Empire ensured that after this collection, so they were living together in quite a good way. I'm not going to go into serious historical details because I think it will take a lot of time. But it was not a federation. So after Russian Empire collapsed and the Soviet time came, so the strategy of government was to settle national issue, as they told them. So as they used to say, so national issue means so that so they really spend a lot of efforts to make these territories living together, and to ensure that they are living in a peaceful and friendly way. So, of course, the process was not realized in one day. But for example, if we speak about the Soviet period, the Soviet Union started with 4 huge subnational units and finished with 15. And so there are different stories of uniting, but so for quite a long time, Soviet country was living peacefully with these 15 subnational units, huge subnational republics. Well, this is just a short.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll touch on that in another question as well. But a question that relates probably more to the geography of Russia, that why its most populated area is in the European part of the Federation. And as we saw on the maps, that's where sort of the smaller units tend to be, whereas the vast regions, as you said, which are more sparsely populated, are in sort of the more eastern part of the Russian Federation. So if you could just briefly comment on that.
Well, just very briefly, I think it's mostly issue of nature, because so the nature conditions in the Asian part in Siberia, they are quite tough, and it's very difficult, for example, to build roads and to build cities, big cities. So it is not really seriously, historically, it is not seriously populated part. So that's, however, in European parts, so conditions, nature conditions are very good, and it historically it was so more populated comparing to Asian part. I think this is the main reason, the nature.
Yeah. And you've mentioned several different kinds of subnational units, including republics and regions, and also the more recent example of federal territories. Could you give an example for that?
As for subnational units, so we have different types. For example, we have republics, and republics are organized purely on national basis. For example, we have Tatarstan, it's a Tatar republic, so populated mostly by Tatars. So we have Chechen Republic, is populated mostly by Chechen people. And so this is a national type. At the same time, we do have federal cities. For example, Moscow is a separate subject of federation. It is populated about 15, I think now, million of people. It's huge, so density is very high. And so this is, of course, not national, it's just a regional type subject of federation. But the system of power is the same. If we compare, for example, Moscow and compare with Tatarstan. So the system of power is the same. However, republic as a national type subject has its own preferences. It has its own official language. So they use two languages. They use Russian and they use Tatar language. And so they have their national symbolic, and so they might have some specific budget support as well.
Yeah. Well, what about a federal territory? Could you give an example for that?
Well, yeah, this is a quite new concept, however, in Russia, at least. However, I think it exists in some other countries, as the United States, for example. It was introduced last year by a new set of amendments to the Russian Constitution. And federal territory is a territory which, well, let me say, controlled directly by federal government. So now we have just one territory. It is placed in a very beautiful place near the sea. It is named Federal Territory Sirius, and Sirius is, it's a special place devoted to young people. It's a place where young people can develop their scientific interests, they can play games, they can do something they want to do. And in order to give them preference, probably, so this decision was made to announce a new federal territory series. However, there are a lot of questions, because we do not have, we have just a clause in a constitution, but there is no special law devoted to federal territories in general. So still there are some questions about the status. I do hope that this concept should develop, otherwise, well, why we need it in the constitution then.
Mm. And on the subject of the different kinds of subnational units, especially the republics, more controversial question on the separatist territories and republics, such as South Ossetia, Abkhazia, or Crimea, which are administered by Russia de facto, but de jure are disputed territories. So how do they fit into that system?
Well, I would like to separate these two stories because Crimea legally, officially the part of Russia, and it is mentioned in the Russian constitution. However, of course, we know that there are some disputes, and so the approaches are different. And so the Crimea is administered absolutely the same way as other Russian regions are administered. So we can compare it with Moscow, with St. Petersburg, with Tatarstan, whichever you like. Speaking about Abkhazia and South Ossetia, so they are not part of Russia. So they have their special status. For sure, Russia has some relations, but I can say that these relations are more of diplomatic nature. But these territories, so legally, they do not constitute part of the Russian territory.
Mm-hmm. And then a similar question on the issue of sort of separation or separatist territories. One thing that also struck me in your presentation, in your outline of the historical developments, and especially how subnational units of republics started to introduce their own rules. That also included, it was one of your slides, the recognition of the right to secede, which struck me. And I assume the Constitutional Court has struck that down and it's been removed now. But the question from the audience is as well, which type of federal subjects have the right of separation? And I'm assuming that means to secede from the Russian Federation. Does that still exist today?
No, for sure not, for sure not. So a Russian constitution prohibits to secede. And so this is, I think, a typical federal practice. When I was speaking about these wild times of end of 20th century, so several, not a lot of, but several subjects of federation, they fixed in their constitution so that they have sovereignty and they can decide by themselves and they can live. For example, Tatarstan, so there were some issues with Bashkortostan and some Caucasian republics. The Constitutional Court of Russia did a really good job and proclaimed all these statements unconstitutional, as they really are. And nowadays, so there are some tracts of that only in the constitution of Tatarstan, but these provisions, they have no legal force because in this aspect, federal legislation prevails.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned, the republics are based on ethnicity or nations. There's a question whether Russia is more of a territory-based federation or an ethno-federation.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a really good question. I think it's more territorial based. If we just calculate all the territories, we have just only 22 republics among 85 subjects. We also can add to them some autonomous territory. So it's a Jewish territory and autonomous region. For example, we have Khanty-Mansi, if it's understandable to you. But just calculating the whole territory, of course, it's the territorially based subnational units prevail.
Mm. And I might try and push you a little further on this, because in previous seminars we have discussed how the introduction of federalist structures has been part of a process to diffuse ethnic or religious tensions in many other countries and nascent federations. So given the republics in Russia are ethnically based with their own official languages and cultures and tradition, do you think there's a danger that unitarization or too much power in the hands of the central government now could incite tensions or unrest in those subunits or republics in particular?
Well, Anya, it's a very, very good question. Thank you very much. Well, I think we need to analyze different aspects of these relations. And just one part is the legal relations, so fixed by laws, constitution, and so on. but another part is political relations. Because from my perspective, federal government, when it is interacting with republics, understanding their national aspiration, is trying probably to give them more powers, to give them more preferences, and trying to invest more money probably. And so in such ways they try to coordinate interests. And in the same way the federation becomes much more asymmetrical, because of course these national subnational units, so ethnically based subnational units, they are getting sometimes better conditions comparing with other regions.
And how does work? How does that work for the other subnational units?
Oh, well, sometimes they're not really happy. Yes, you can expect, because so governors, so they try to lobby their interest as well. The government, the federal government, is trying to find the middle, something in the middle, in order to prevent these huge national aspirations leading to some critical situations, and trying to coordinate interests with those regions who are just territorially based. For example, oblasts, we have some quite not really rich oblasts, so the territories which probably would require much more attention from the federal government as well.
So not just attention, but speaking about power and influence, percentage-wise, how much power do the regions or different units have in the Russian parliament, so the State Duma, but especially in the Federal Council?
So Federal Council is created as a chamber representing interests of subnational units. Last year we had a reform, as we had a lot of reforms, but it was one of the parts of this reform. So when together with representatives of subnational units, Council of Federation is formed by representatives of federation. And now the president can nominate 30 representatives of the Russian Federation as a federation and send them to the Council of Federation as well. Frankly speaking, this constitutional provision was not realized. However, we'll see how it works. Probably it can influence interests of subnational units, because they would need to establish one more dialogue with these representatives as well, in order to participate in this parliamentary activity. What I would like to mention as well, so there is such a body in Russia which is named State Council, a State Council. It was created, at the beginning of 21st century in 2000, in order to give platform for governors for coordination with the president. It is just advisory body to the Russian president. But even nowadays, all the governors, so they are part of this body, and they have direct contact with the Russian president, so they can lobby their interest as well on that level as well.
This seminar series is all about learning lessons from other countries. And so there's a wider question on what major issues Russia has faced being an asymmetric federation, as you've described, and what can other countries learn?
So you mean good questions, or good lessons, or bad lessons?
Well, you know, given that the question is phrased as what major issues has Russia faced, I think that's slightly more sort of negative, or problems. What problems has it faced?
From my perspective, being a symmetrical federation is a really tough job for the federal government, because they need to coordinate all these asymmetrical interests in such a way so not to make really serious harm to other subnational units who can't push, who can't bargain, who are just waiting for some support. And I think this is an issue of coordination. And analyzing Russian history, from my perspective, in some period of time, Russia was not really successful. I mean, end of the last century, which led to really claims of independence. And at the first part of the first 10 years, I can say so, 10 years of the 21st century, from my perspective, Russia can share its experience because the situation was really stabilized in a situation when it is still a symmetrical federation. It is still asymmetrical, and this is, I think, real science to coordinate this interest. And probably we can share this experience as well.
Mm. I would like to, I know we're reaching our time limit, but ask you on the role of political culture, which is something we've previously discussed as well. How ingrained are Russia's federal or federalist structures in political culture? What views do Russians generally have on federalism? You've mentioned the protest of some of these subnational units about becoming a more unitary state, but is there also public enthusiasm for decentralization or the federalist structures and principles, or do most citizens prefer a strong central government guaranteeing stability and security?
Mm-hmm. So from my perspective, this is based on historical and cultural ground, because traditionally Russia was operated by one center of power, and probably our citizens are accustomed to have more centralized power. So that is why I would like to say that I have mentioned it, but I would like to say I can't expect Russia to be decentralized, because still people are relying on federal government, still they're relying on a presidential power, even to settle some of their local issues. This is in culture, I think, nowadays. But I don't think that just ordinary people are really thinking a lot about whether it's a federation or unitary state. Probably lawyers and academicians are trying to investigate this field, but I can't even imagine Russia as a unitary state, because we'll for sure have a lot of problems in having these national, subnational, ethnically based subnational units, and so they will not be, they would not be happy at all by making them territorial as other ones. So the answer is so that we expect to have a federation, and it should be centralized, but well, this centralization should be quite mild from my perspective.
So would you say Russians are sort of semi-federalists?
Well, probably yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, regular participants of our seminars will know what comes next. My very last question for the seminar, because we are, of course, all about promoting federalism as well. I've asked every expert in the series how people, especially in nascent federal societies or countries, become true federalists. We've looked at safeguarding mechanisms, specific constitutions, or political culture, as we just discussed, or ethnic factors. What is your answer for aspiring federal countries?
Well, from my perspective, federation gives more possibilities for development of different people and different cultures. If we dive into a history of many countries, we see that the territory was changing, and so people are different. And from my perspective, federation gives much more possibilities for individual development comparing with unitary state. This is my answer.
Right. Well, I know we've sort of run a bit over time, but we also started a bit late, and apologies to our audience for the hiccups in the beginning. But I'm now going to bring the discussion to a close. This was our last seminar before the summer break, at least for us in the Northern Hemisphere, the summer break. But we will be back with a new series of speakers in the autumn. In the meantime, you can watch all previous seminars on our website as well. We've visited, so to speak, India, Philippines, and of course our home country Bavaria and in Germany in previous session, but we've also discussed democracy and federalism and how intergovernmental relations work in federalist countries, or how federalism can help in conflict-ridden countries. It's been my pleasure hosting you for the last 9 seminars. Thank you all very much for watching today and previous sessions and participating. Thank you so much for putting in all those questions today. But special thanks to you, Elena, for your presentation today, for sharing your insights to the complicated structures of Russian unitarism or federalism, and of course for answering all those questions the audience wanted to ask you. So depending on where you are watching from or participating now, I wish you all a very good evening or good morning if you're tuning in from further west, or einen schönen Feierabend. Bye bye.
Thank you.